So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah!
Now that we got the coaching changes out of the way, now that we've added a really bright mind in Joe Brady at offensive coordinator, and we've added a really veteran former player in Larry Johnson on the defensive line to be the new defensive lines coach in Detroit, now we can move on to player re-signings and free agent re-signings to see who we want to keep on this roster and who we want to take into the future as Detroit Lions to build this roster and to build this team into a true playoff and eventually Super Bowl contender. Now, the Detroit Lions have a unusually large free agency pool this year as far as their players because of the unusual offseason that we saw a year ago, offering one-year contracts to players that were projected to start. Guys like Alex Anzalone got a one-year deal. Guys like Tim Boyle got a one-year deal as he was projected to be a backup and eventually did start 3 games for the Detroit Lions. So you're going to see a really big pool of players this year as free agents, and I think there are only a few players that the Detroit Lions eventually should end up bringing back. Now, the first player that I wanted to bring back was Jalen Reeves-Maben. Jalen Reeves-Maben was a special teams captain and was a leader on the field, and when he actually saw time as a defensive starter due to injury to Alex Anzalone and the release of Jamie Collins, you saw exactly the kind of playmaker that Jalen Reeves-Maben could be. He's forced 2 fumbles at the end of football games, one versus the Minnesota Vikings and one versus the Atlanta Falcons. Both of them were game-changing plays, and both of them were supposed to be plays to win the Detroit Lions that football game. Now, we all know what happened in Atlanta, and we all know what happened in Minnesota, but that does not take away from the fact that Jalen Reeves-Maben made a big play. It does not take away from the fact that Jalen Reeves-Maben, in big moments, tends to make big plays. He's pretty athletic. He's got a good size. He's got really good instincts for a linebacker. He's pretty good in pass coverage. He's not a bad pass rusher, as I've seen him get pressure several times on linebacker blitz. He's really a jack of all trades, and even if he's not going to see the field as a starter early in the season, as I do project him to be our linebacker 3, I think he can be a huge special teams contributor, be a huge captain for this team, and be a leader for the Detroit Lions, especially if injury arises again and he has to see starting time yet again in 2022. Now, for Jalen Reeves-Maben, I want to sign him to a 3-year, $5 million contract. Now, I decide these contracts and I average out these contracts over the years. So like for Jalen Reeves-Maben, you take 3 divided by 5. That's what his yearly salary would be. And I know that it's not going to be exact numbers because you can front load and back load contracts and all of that. The numbers aren't necessarily important as much as the years. And I was basing these contracts off of former contracts that they've signed, their performances this year, and their projected roles on the Detroit Lions. And I think for a special teams ace, a guy that is going to be your projected linebacker 3, but can step in and be a special teams captain, I think locking him up for 3 more years, giving him, I think, $1.3 million per year is pretty good value for a linebacker that can make you a lot of plays. I think it's fair value for Jalen Reeves-Maben, and I think it's fair value for the Detroit Lions. Now, Alex Anzalone is the next player that I was looking to re-sign for the Detroit Lions. Alex Anzalone was an actual defensive captain. He was the captain of the defense for the Detroit Lions. He was the person with the headset in the middle talking to the defensive coordinator. He's the guy that got everybody lined up. He's a big playmaker, having turnovers both on the ground and through the air this year for the Detroit Lions, and he is the heart and soul and leader of the Detroit Lions defense. He's the guy that gets everybody lined up. He is the guy that makes plays. He's the guy that gets energy up. He is the guy that never lets his teammates quit. And I think you can see a really big difference from when Alex Anzalone is on the field and when he's off the field, right? Games that he missed include Denver, include Seattle, and in both of those games, the Lions really struggled defensively. You know, without their leader, it's hard to get lined up. Without that leader and relying on rookies and relying on inexperienced players, it's hard to get your defense aligned correctly. And Alex Anzalone does that very well. He's a big linebacker. He's got good size, good speed. He is a playmaker. Unfortunately, struggled with injury this year at times, but when he's on the field, he's a really big time playmaker and a really good player for the Lions to hold on to. I would sign him to another, very similar to Reeves-Maben, a 3-year deal worth $6 million, give him $2 million a year, a pretty, not significant pay bump, but a pretty recognizable pay upgrade from what he just signed a year ago. It's going to be more money per year, more base salary, a bigger cap hit for the Detroit Lions. And I think for a guy that in his first year as starter couldn't stay healthy the entire year, but when he was on the field, played good for a majority of the snaps, I think $2 million a year on average is a really good salary for your projected linebacker one. Now, Josh Reynolds is the next player that I wanted to sign. Josh Reynolds came in off waiver wire from the Tennessee Titans. Is a guy that has chemistry with Jared Goff and a guy that really helped unlock this Detroit Lions offense. He's a guy that Jared Goff felt comfortable with. He's a guy that Jared Goff had the confidence in to go deep to in the Chicago game. And ever since joining the team, Jared Goff has just really had that chemistry with Josh Reynolds. Now, Josh Reynolds only played half a year for the Detroit Lions, so I don't want to sign him long term, but I want to sign him to a pretty similar contract to what the Titans gave him, with maybe a little bit more incentives to stay in Detroit with Jared Goff. I'd be comfortable signing him to a 1-year, $1.3 million contract. Josh Reynolds is my projected wide receiver 2. He makes Goff comfortable. He gives Goff confidence down the field, and he is a big body wide receiver that has gone up and made plays several times for the Detroit Lions, bringing in 2 touchdowns in just really 4 or 5 games started. And I mean, him and Goff have only been on the same field and only started games, I think, twice or 3 times this season, being in Thanksgiving, being against Arizona Cardinals, and I think the Denver Broncos game again as well. Maybe there's 4 games in there, but they haven't seen the field together that much this season, with Jared Goff being on the injury reserve, and then with Josh Reynolds being on the COVID list, right? They've not really been on the field together all that much, but when they are on the field, they have a really special connection. And I think if Jared Goff is to stay around next year, giving him his safety blanket, giving him his security guy is a really smart decision. And for just $1.3 million of the Detroit Lions' $40 million salary cap, I think it's a really good deal to bring back your veteran wide receiver to start on the boundary next to a player that is yet to be named. Now, Dean Marlowe is another player that I think earned a contract this year. He's my projected safety 4, so that tells you anything. I do expect to address the safety position later in this video, and I do expect to address the safety position in free agency, as I think the Lions will do as well. And Dean Marlowe, I think, has earned another 1-year contract. He didn't play a lot this year, didn't make any big plays, had 1 fumble recovery versus the Atlanta Falcons, but overall wasn't a big playmaker, didn't turn the football over a lot, but played well enough and stepped up as a starter well enough to, in my opinion, warrant another 1-year prove-it kind of a contract. He can be a big special teams guy. He has the ability to step in. He's phenomenal depth for the Detroit Lions. And if Dean Marlowe is your 4th safety, you're doing something pretty right in the secondary. Now, Evan Brown is the next player that I'm looking to re-sign for the Detroit Lions. Evan Brown, I would sign to a 3-year, $3 million contract. And I know it's $1 million a year for a backup center, but after coming in this year, after showing what he has to prove to the Detroit Lions, I don't think he's as good as Frank Ragnow. He's obviously not as good as Frank Ragnow. He could maybe go somewhere and be a lower quality starter in the NFL, right? I think he'd be a decent starter for the Detroit Lions. I think he'd be a decent starter anywhere in the NFL. But I don't think he'd ever reach quite the top, quite the peaks of like a Corey Linsley, of a Creed Humphrey, or of a Frank Ragnow. But he's going to be a solid football player. And I think locking up solid quality depth on your football team is one of the ways that, the Packers are one of the best teams year in and year out. Is one of the reasons that Baltimore is still in the playoff race despite their numbers. One of the reasons that New Orleans is in the playoff race despite playing 53 different starters this year, which is an NFL record. The reason that these teams are still playoff contenders, even with all their injuries, is because of their depth. And I think the only way to build a true Super Bowl competitive team is to build up your depth and is to build your roster as deep as possible. You found a diamond in the rough with Evan Brown. You have to keep him on the roster. Pay him a little bit more, maybe make him one of the higher paid backup centers. I think $1 million a year for a backup center is a little bit expensive, or at least least it seems a little bit expensive, but I think he's more than earned it because he is a quality, high quality backup and actually can step up and play starting time and play starting reps with the one team if Frank Ragnow unfortunately goes down with injury at some point again in the future. He's my projected center to obviously behind Frank Ragnow, but that does not mean he has no value on this football team. You lock up your depth early, you lock up your good players when you have to, and Evan Brown is a good player. Now, Jason Cabinda, the next player that I really wanted to sign, is the starting fullback and will be the projected fullback one going into next year if the Lions decide to bring him back. As a fullback, you're not going to make a lot of money, but he is young, I believe only 26 years old, and I'd feel comfortable giving Jason Cabinda a 2-year, $1.3 to $1.5 million contract. Keep him in Detroit for 2+ years. He's a very Dan Campbell guy, a guy that was willing to switch positions, a guy that was willing to play a whole different brand of football just to stay on the field. He's a guy that loves football. He's a guy that loves playing for his teammates. And again, I think he has 2 or 3 touchdowns as a fullback this year for the Lions. He's been pretty good for the Lions as a good blocker, as a good fullback, especially considering he's a converted linebacker. I would feel very comfortable bringing back Jason Cabinda on this deal. He's a high effort, quality fullback, and just overall is a very Dan Campbell-esque type of player. Now, moving on back to the starters. Tracy Walker is, I think, the biggest name in free agency this year. Tracy Walker, a former 3rd-round pick out of the University of Louisiana. He was a 3rd-round selection, was looked at as a reach at the time, but has made a lot of big impact plays, and I believe by PFF is actually graded as a top 10 safety in the NFL. Now, whether Tracy Walker is a top 10 safety in the NFL is for everybody else to argue, but at the end of the day, Tracy Walker is one of the quietest stars in the NFL. I mean, I know Tracy Walker doesn't have turnovers. I know he doesn't have picks. I know he doesn't really have forced fumbles like that, but he is a really good player. He tackles well in open space. He reads the game incredibly well. He is a rangy, ball-hawking safety, and even though he's started in just about every single game, he's only been targeted 26 times down the field, which means quarterbacks really don't want to target Tracy Walker, and if you're only giving 26 opportunities to make a play on the football in a 17-game season, that means that your quarterback respects you. That means that the opposing quarterback respects you a lot, and even though he doesn't have those numbers on his stat sheet, you look at the interception by Alex Anzalone, that ball was popped up in the air because Tracy Walker made a play on the ball. He has multiple passes defended this year, and overall, he has had a really quietly good season. And Tracy Walker very recently came out and said that he wants to be a member of this Detroit Lions team long term. You might have to give him a little bit more money than 2 years, $3 million, but I would feel very comfortable giving Tracy Walker a 2-year deal, giving him whatever fair value you think is worth for Tracy Walker. Again, the numbers aren't necessarily specific. That was kind of, $1.5 million a year is kind of similar to what he was on his rookie contract with a slight pay bump. I don't think somebody that doesn't get a lot of turnovers deserves a huge sum of money, but I think somebody that, plays with the effort of Tracy Walker and can give you the upside of Tracy Walker deserves another chance to prove what he can do in the 2nd and 3rd year under Aaron Glenn in an Aaron Glenn system. He's my projected safety one, and although he doesn't have the big stat sheet numbers, he is just a super good, quietly good player for the Detroit Lions. Getting on to the final 2 re-signings of the offseason, I have the Detroit Lions re-signing Matt Nelson to a 1-year, $800,000 contract. He started right tackle for the Detroit Lions early in the season, was a quality player, occasionally checked in as a tight end or as a 6th offensive lineman, and when Matt Nelson was healthy with that entire offensive line, the Lions running game looked really good. Matt Nelson kind of unlocked the potential of the Lions run game, and if the Lions offensive line can stay healthy next year, if they can get their starting 5 plus Matt Nelson on the edge to run block, and TJ Hawkinson being your actual tight end, also having the ability to run block really well, that's going to open up a lot of holes. And I think Matt Nelson, despite being the 6th offensive lineman on this team and despite being the backup tackle, I think is going to play a key role next year for the Detroit Lions. And then the very last player that I wanted to re-sign from this class, you might be waiting for Charles Harris, you might be waiting for somebody else like Tim Boyle or David Blau, but the last player that I think the Lions need to re-sign this offseason is long snapper, Scott Daly. Yes, we're ending it with the most exciting one of the bunch, but truthfully, Scott Daly earned his spot on this team. He beat out Don Muhlbach. He beat out the GOAT of long snappers last year, signed a one-year contract for very minimal money, and I think very similarly to what Don Muhlbach did when he solidified himself as the Lions long snapper, you're going to see Scott Daly sign a 5 to 6 year contract for $3.5 million. He's not going to get paid a lot of money per year, but this contract that I came up with is the one that I think is most likely to happen because I based it off of Don Muhlbach's contract. I based it off of the contract Muhlbach had when he solidified himself as a starter for the Detroit Lions. And I think 5 years, $3.5 million is the deal that Scott Daly is going to get. He is going to be the long snapper one. He was a really good long snapper for the Detroit Lions this season, and he is going to solidify our special teams unit with himself, Jack Fox, and Riley Patterson being all three very young, very talented players that are going to help the Detroit Lions special teams be one of the best in the NFL in the very near future. And I think all of these players earned their contracts, and I think some of them earned better contracts than others, right? You look at Jalen Reeves-Maben, you look at Alex Anzalone, guys that started and made big plays this year got longer contracts, but guys that maybe didn't, guys like Josh Reynolds, guys like Dean Marlowe, guys like even Tracy Walker, who maybe earned another chance but didn't earn a long-term contract, got that 1 to 2 year deal. And I approached this free agency a lot like Brad Holmes approached free agency last year, where, right, I'm going to give some guys a chance. And if you played well and earned your spot, I'm going to give you another chance on this roster. And I approached that with both the re-signings and the actual signings of the free agency that we will get to in just a few minutes. But I wanted to approach this as realistically as possible. Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes didn't give out a lot of money in free agency last year, despite, or in the exception of, obviously, the Romeo Okwara deal. But outside Romeo Okwara, nobody got big money. Everybody stayed here for minimal contracts. And really, the Lions keep players that earn their spots, or if they think they can earn a spot, they give them a 1 year contract to earn and prove their spot on the Lions roster. And I think that's the approach that they're going to go with again. Their approach is to build through the draft and add a few key free agents each and every year. That's what they did last year. I think it's what they're going to do this year. And I think every single player that I just mentioned, from Jalen Reeves-Maben to Scott Daly, whether it's a starter or a backup, I think earned another contract with the Detroit Lions, whether it be 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years. Every single player, I think, earned that contract that I had given them, and it leaves the Lions with quite a bit of cap space going into the actual free agency period. I believe with their projected salary cap minus the average yearly cap hit of these contracts, it leaves them with just under $27 million to play with in free agency. And with that money in free agency, I have the Detroit Lions making a couple big time signings. Nothing too expensive, nothing too big, but guys that I think would work really well in Detroit, would play to our offensive and defensive coordinator strengths, guys that our offensive and defensive coordinators would love the opportunity to coach, and guys that I think can really help elevate this Detroit Lions offense to the next level in 2022. So without any further ado, let's get right over to the actual free agent signings this year for the Lions.